Hi, I'm Aidan Brown, and we have my fantastic friend Ben Matjiu in the studio today. He's running the production. And then, of course, we have Mandy Wiener. I'm actually not going to spend very much time introducing her at all. She's a South African that has a very significant profile, and I'm just going to go right into swinging for the fences because we just don't have that much time. You started out being assigned to the Keppel investigation, and that is basically how you started your career, almost by chance, as an investigative journalist within the realm of the crime world, criminal syndicates and that sort of thing. You now have quite a remarkable career behind you, and you have a lot of experience, arguably the most in the country, within somewhat nefarious realms as well, kind of like dangerous realms. You kind of deal with, sort of dangerous people in a sense. With wisdom and hindsight, and perhaps having bared a heavy burden at times, doing the kind of work that you do, is there any advice that you would give to a younger Mandy Wiener, somebody that's just starting out on this road, perhaps things that you didn't know that you wish you did, maybe fill in the gaps of your own naivety in a sense?
Thank you so much for having me, Aidan. Ben, great to be here. Sure. So I'm such a different person now to what I was when I was 20. And when I was first reporting on the Keppel story, and just the stage of life I'm in now. So I reflect on who I was then, and I think it was my naivety that was to my benefit. The fact that I thought I was invincible, that I thought I was bulletproof, that I could get any story. I was desperate for exclusivity. I wanted the scoop. I really wanted to build my profile. I'm way more chilled out now in that sense. But also, I did things then that were probably quite reckless. I wrote about people in a way that was maybe not as considered as it could have been. I just wanted to tell the story. And I think that in a lot of ways that helped me get to where I am now. But I think if I had to tell my younger self that, I probably wouldn't listen anyway, because I knew better. I wasn't willing to take any kind of advice or criticism. But I also think that's what made me successful and made me able to do that kind of work, was the fact that I maybe was a bit naive about what I was doing and what I was trying to prove and trying to do. I think had I been more inhibited, had I been more considered, had I been more mindful of the risks that I was taking, I would never have done it.
That's very honest. I think in a sense, maybe not knowing helped bear the burden. Is it more difficult now, knowing what you know about the world and having a broader perspective on life in general?
Yeah, definitely. I think that I now think twice, 3 times, 4 times before I say anything about another human. I think about the fact that they have got children or a family. I mean, at the same time, if you put yourself in a position of authority and you're a politician, then you're fair game. If you're a criminal, then you're fair game. I'm just more considered. I think things through a lot more. I've always been a very thorough journalist, so I'm always, make sure that I fact check, and I think for that reason I have developed a reputation for being trustworthy. But I make mistakes. I'm not, we're all fallible, and I think that I've learned a lot over the years. That's the benefit of institutional memory, is having been around a long time. A lot of journalists don't stick around. A lot of journalists go and become spokespeople at government departments and work in the private sector. But when you've been doing the job for a long time, you learn a lot.
It sounds to me like your career has basically forced you to fortify your empath skill set to some extent. And I would imagine that that's actually, has helped your career along, made you more endearing, I suppose, to people like Radovan Krejcir. I know that you found him to be somewhat charming.
Yeah.
And I guess, that it helps to have that empath ability.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons that people always trusted me to speak to me, was because I was willing to listen. I found that what often happened with many journalists was that they were very quick to judge and to cast people into certain roles. And I was always quite interested to hear the stories from the Radovan Krejcirs or the Mikey Schultz kind of characters, and give them an opportunity to speak as well. That didn't always count in my favor. I often got a lot of backlash for that, for glorifying criminals, for giving them a platform. But for me, I would rather hear from these people and let them speak their version and let us understand the world that they live in, rather than it being completely isolated and for nobody to even know what's going on.
That's very interesting, and you've done an amazing job with that. I'll come to this later on in a different question. But as a one-person show or as an institution, there's a handful of South Africans that have done more for, I would say, freedom of the rule of law in a general sense, by ventilating issues in South Africa than some of our biggest institutions have done in the past. I know, for example, our NPA was absolutely worn into the ground, and it's slowly building itself back up, and it's had some difficulties. But in the absence of such institutions, individuals like yourself and organizations as well, like the Daily Maverick, what incredible work you've done to help concretize South Africa's democratic framework. So thank you for that.
But it's not me alone.
No, of course not.
I think that my colleagues, especially if you look at Daily Maverick, if you look at the work done around state capture and the Gupta leaks, it's something that we don't often speak about enough, is just the incredible fortitude shown by the Fourth Estate in South Africa. And you speak about the NPA. The NPA was completely eviscerated. Oh, yeah. It was, it lost 50% of its capacity during the state capture era. And it was really captured. And it's so important that we had the strength and the resources within the media to be able to report on what was going on at the NPA, to report on the criminal justice system, and just that nexus between politics and organized crime and business and capture and just corruption, entrenched corruption in the country. So the media really has been paramount when it comes to that.
I absolutely couldn't agree more. I'm going to ask you again in a question just now, and I'm not sure if you will be prepared to share as much information as I'd like, but I will give it a shot. You've mentioned before that you vision a spectrum of whistleblowers, and that you don't just see people as either being one or not being one within the South African context specifically. Some of them are pure ethical, some forced, some of these people are coerced, and not all of them are as morally and ethically bound as others. I would say that people like Athol Williams is right at the top of the tier. Yeah. And then you get some people like our new friend Ace Makashuli's PA, who is probably going to be coerced into being some kind of whistleblower, I imagine. I vision journalists like yourself as being somewhere on that spectrum. I believe that you are whistleblowers in the South African context. Do you agree with that, or do you think that investigative journalists or journalists as a whole have a separate role to play and must exist as its own institution and not fall within the realm of whistleblowers?
That's a really interesting question. No one's ever asked me that before. So I wrote a book on whistleblowers a few years ago, and that's why I've become very much an advocate for a change in legislation around whistleblowers, and that's just in terms of why I speak about this so much. So I don't think journalists are whistleblowers. I think that they perform a different role, but I think that the two are obviously mutually beneficial, and you, as a journalist, you rely very heavily on whistleblowers. I do have a fairly contentious definition of whistleblowers. Some academics agree with me, where I do believe it's a very wide spectrum, where you do have essentially 3 different kinds of whistleblowers, as you've described. The one is entirely altruistic, the Ethel Williams kind of whistleblower, who it's black or white, there's no grey, you're wrong, you've got to blow the whistle. The second one is an accidental whistleblower, where they didn't set out to become a whistleblower, but they realize that if they don't blow the whistle, they will be complicit. And then at the far end of the spectrum, you've got those who are complicit in corruption, and they want to save their skin. And they acknowledge that they're doing it not for altruistic reasons, but rather for survival. They remain a whistleblower. And I think that as a journalist, you rely on all 3 of those whistleblowers. It's not just 3, it's a full spectrum. But the only way we can do our jobs as journalists is if you have somebody who brings you information, and there's that trust relationship. And we saw that in the Gupta leaks. Exactly. I write about the whistleblowers there and what they had to sacrifice for the benefit of the country. And there were many, many whistleblowers who came forward during the State Capture Commission to tell the country what went down about the brown leather bag stuffed with cash and the Saxon World shebeen and all of that. And I think that as journalists, it's important for us to guide whistleblowers, to protect whistleblowers, to give them the platform, and I think that they benefit one another. I don't think they are the same.
Are you aware of any legislative developments to protect whistleblowers? At one stage, there was some rough coverage that they had, for example, with employment law and labour law and that kind of thing. It was very vague and non-specific. Has there been any legislative developments?
So when the Protected Disclosures Act came out 20 years ago, it was seen as cutting edge. It was really good compared to international best practice. But it's since become a dinosaur. That's how some of the whistleblower organizations internationally describe it. So it's just nowhere near where it needs to be, considering how corruption has evolved. So we do have some legislation in the country. It doesn't sufficiently cover what whistleblowers require. So there's been quite a lot of consultation. When Ronald Lamola was the Justice Minister in the 6th administration, he put out a discussion document from the department, and quite a few whistleblower organizations and individual whistleblowers gave a public comment on that, because they invited public comment. And most of them agreed that they didn't think it was really sufficient. So they went around the world and had a look at international best practice, and they pretty much settled, as I understand it, on a kind of Canadian version, although they looked at the US, and they have options, right? They could look at the False Claims Act in the US, where there is between 10 and 30% paid to a whistleblower of a successful whistleblowing claim. Yes. So, for example, last year, one whistleblower got 2.9 billion rand, which is massive. There's risks with that, because you could have bounty hunting and false claims. But as things stand, we've had the president go to the State Capture Commission. We've had the president write about this in his weekly newsletter. There have been recommendations made by the Chief Justice, Raymond Zondo. They've all said the right things, but there's still no change in legislation. So we still have this archaic legislation that doesn't work. You still have people like Ethel Williams who've had to seek refuge overseas. And unfortunately, what happens to whistleblowers in this country is that they are dragged through the courts. So they are bankrupt. They suffer, lots of mental issues by their own admission. Many of their families fall apart. They lose their jobs. They become unemployed, unemployable. I always say they wear the scarlet letter W, because everybody loves a whistleblower until they're in their own organization, and then nobody wants to touch them. So we have to change the way that the law protects and rewards and encourages whistleblowers, but we also need a societal revolution in how we speak about whistleblowers and how we treat them.
Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt about it. It's not an enviable position for anyone. it appears that a lot of our corruption in South Africa has a synergy with obviously high-ranking government officials and politicians, and they are the people responsible for pushing new legislation. So there's obviously a bit of a conflict of interest in terms of that development. I imagine that a lot of them wouldn't want more sophisticated laws that would help ultimately prosecute.
Yes and no, because the ANC keeps speaking about renewal and how they acknowledge they need to renew if they are going to change their reputation. We've had Cyril Ramaphosa telling the ANC in an internal letter that they are accused number one in the dock when it comes to corruption. So they've had to fix that image. And that's why he's spoken about whistleblowers and whistleblower legislation. So I think that it works both ways. I think that you do have senior officials that are implicated in corruption who don't want to change things, but ultimately it's a necessity. I think that if they're going to, and we've seen from the last election results, that if the ANC is going to want to stay in power as the most supported party in the GNU, at least, then they're going to have to fix that corruption-tarnished image.
Yes, I absolutely couldn't argue with that even one little bit. If they don't fix this corruption-tarnished image, 2029 is going to be a dismal year for them. They'll disappear into absolutely oblivion as a political organization. So I think, I would say that's a really good assessment.
I don't think they'll disappear into oblivion in 2029. I think that
exaggerating. When I say into oblivion, it's a bit of an exaggeration. But for the ANC, from where they were, from the high place that they fell, I mean, if they went to say 30% or 33% organization, I mean, for them, that's inside 3 decades. That's oblivion.
That is oblivion in many sense. I mean, the fact that they lost 16 percentage points in this election, to go from 56% to 40%, that's huge. Like, you don't see other political parties losing that kind of support in one election cycle.
Our constitution, and more specifically our democracy and the rule of law in South Africa is robust. I think we have a very robust and bright future ahead. I think that we have very many good things in place. But first we have to be a little bit pessimistic. I saved that right for the end. I saved the optimism for the...
You're supposed to do it the other way around. You're supposed to be pessimistic first and then optimistic.
I must say I wasn't as organized for this interview as I'd like to be, so I might be all over the place a little bit, actually.
It's more fun that way.
Yeah, it is actually, and I feel like I get a little bit more of an organic conversation like this. Sometimes, like with Professor Saville, sometimes it feels like we're just lecturing each other after a while.
That's okay. I mean, people always say, how long does it take you to prepare for the radio show? I do every day, and it's an hour-long radio show, and I always say 20 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's all in your head anyway.
Yeah. It's an amazing place to be able to get there. I hope I get there someday. I'd like to talk about 3 additional pillars to a healthy and well-functioning democracy. You referred to the 4th state, is that correct?
Yeah.
I really like that term. But I basically refer to being freedom of media and press. It is the freedom of the academic elite as well. I consider that to be a very significant part of a well-functioning democracy, and also of big business or business in general. So business leadership holds a great role in steering well-functioning global democracies. And I think that the KGB handbook under Jacob Zuma was so well deployed in South Africa that he realized this as well. He was very well versed in this, and he went out to capture the pillars of democracy that we are all aware of, in addition to these shadow pillars of democracy, if you want to call it that. And I think he did actually quite well to capture the press at one stage. He had some somewhat radical friends in front of the typewriter, like Mr. Survey.
Who's still very much active behind the typewriter.
Which, I mean, it also leads me to another question. Is a person like that and the kinds of institutions that he runs, is that part of a healthy, vibrant democracy and free media, the same way that I envision the EFF as being part of a healthy, vibrant democracy? Or do you see that as being something nefarious that really shouldn't be allowed in South Africa?
So I think that it's important that we have diversity of views. I don't think we can have this monolithic approach as the media, where, you know, we're all white minority capital and, you know, mass media as people see it. And I always encourage people to read widely, and we need a diversity of views. So what for me is concerning then is a lack of funding when it comes to the media. But also when you see an institution like independent media being effectively used as a mouthpiece captured, I think you lose that diversity of media, because it's not doing actual journalism. It's doing smear campaigns and tarnishing the image of legitimate journalists. And it's there purely for the benefit of Iqbal Survey. And I think we've seen, you know, most recently last week, we saw a press council judgment absolutely damning of Iqbal Survey and what was being done. And it makes it very clear that this is not proper journalism, that this is purely for the benefit of one person. So that does concern me. You know, and when you say that the media was captured by Jacob Zuma, I think elements of it were captured.
Elements, yes.
I think that we definitely saw some brown envelope journalism. We've had to do some introspection as a fraternity, I suppose. We've had to make sure that we've got measures in place. And what's been quite good is how the media has called itself out, where the media is willing to report on colleagues that have taken money or have written something that is clearly malicious. Look at the decouplets, man. Like, crazy story. Like, it's quite clear that the decouplets never existed. And yet you have this, like, full-on institution in independent media trying to convince us that the decouplets were a thing and they were real and that there was human trafficking. And it's wild. And as a journalist, I saw that story the minute it broke. It was an hour before I went on air. And I said to my producer, there is something weird about this. There is no ways that this is right. And we didn't touch it, because we could see straight away that there was dodginess afoot. So I think that we also need to be quite vigilant as journalists to make sure that we don't just assume the truth, and that we don't just follow our colleagues, that we do question. And I think the media has been pretty good about that. I think also, now that we've gone into a government of national unity with a essentially weakened opposition, it's going to require us as the media to be even more vigilant. It's going to require civil society, Chapter 9 organizations, NGOs, the private sector, and the media to be more vigilant, because our opposition parties are weakened.
I believe that, going back to the decouplet story, that serves as a canary in the coal mine for how easy disinformation is to utilize in the South African context, given the relatively, I don't want to say illiterate, but the relatively uneducated state of our nation as a whole in relation to the sophistication of modern media. It's very easy to carry people's attention. Anybody that's done Standard 5 biology would have had suspicions immediately raised. You know, if you have triplets, you need extra pediatricians and OBGYNs and specializations. If you have 4 babies, it requires an entire, like, half a hospital wing of specialists. I mean, 10 that nobody was going, guys, that every pediatric nurse in the country isn't talking about this.
Exactly.
You know,
I think there were some big red flags. You know, there really were. The fact that there was not one official person quoted in the initial story was the red flag for, as a journalist, that there was no one. There was one phantom doctor, I think, that was quoted. So there were lots of red flags. And then that's obviously the point you make, that it would require an army of medical professionals. And we hadn't even heard about this, and suddenly the babies were born. Like, it's a no-brainer.
There's two things that South Africans, I believe, are seeing for the first time, and a lot of us aren't aware that we're seeing it because we're not used to it. The first thing is that disinformation pieces, deliberate. I'm not sure if the decouplets was a deliberate disinformation piece. I think it could have been lost in the broken telephone system, but we are starting to really feel disinformation in South Africa, deliberate disinformation. We certainly saw it during the July riots.
Yeah.
Fairly sophisticated disinformation, targeted disinformation, I believe, obviously organized, acted on purpose with intent. And it's not just the disinformation that we're talking about, from the surveys. It's also the way that under the KGB handbook, they started hammering certain individuals like Karen Morn. So not only do they have these disinformation mouthpieces, but they're taking the honest, hardworking, ethical people that are trying to do a good job, and they're hammering them into the ground. And collectively, I think that they did quite a lot of damage.
Yeah, it goes back to Bell Pottinger. That's kind of the evolution of it, and the genesis in many ways is the fact that through the Guptas, you had ANN7 and the New Age, which were being passed off as legitimate media organizations. But then with Bell Pottinger, you saw this deliberate malicious campaign to discredit journalists, including Karen, including Ferial, Peter Bruce, people who were really kind of at the vanguard of fighting state capture. And I do think that they did damage to people personally. You just cannot underestimate what that is like to go through that kind of abuse, online abuse. And Karen has been through the very worst of it. But I think that I'm not sure that it's impacted their credibility at all. I think that people are pretty discerning and realize what was going down. And I think that in a way it's almost emboldened them as journalists to tell the truth, and has given them credibility. But I do think there is a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation. You spoke about the July riots, COVID. I think that there was a lot of misinformation around COVID. And I think that's why I kind of saw it as my role to kind of sift through the clutter. And I made a point of trying to post information that was checked, that was fact-checked, that was came from credible sources. And I think that, it's amazing. I always joke about how it's always your auntie on the family WhatsApp group that is sharing absolute nonsense that clearly doesn't has no basis in truth, that comes from the dodgiest website, and they'll share it because they believe it to be true. And I do think that, and I speak about this a lot in the keynotes that I speak to corporates about, that I think that we tend to seek out those narratives and those stories that perpetuate our view of the world. So whether it's credible or not, if it aligns with what we think, we'll give that oxygen and credibility. So we'll share it on our social media and our family WhatsApp groups. Whether it's true or not, as long as it feeds the narrative, we're willing to share it. And people aren't necessarily, I always say they don't have good social media hygiene.
I would definitely agree with that. I see it in a different light, so I'd describe it slightly differently. When I was a child, I'm closer now to 40 than I am to 30, but when I was a kid, we got to nursery school with Ben, coincidentally, and we had a librarian. Her name was Mrs. Lethbridge. And on day one, they took us into the library at Fairways Primary School, and they said, this is how a library works. This is how you find information. And they took you to the little drawer, and they showed you how the drawer works, and they took you and they showed you all the bookshelves and the fiction and the non-fiction, and you learned to find information. And within a single generation, to Benny's daughter now, she is going to have to be taught actively how to force information out. And that's happened in a single generation, and that's absolutely radical. that she no longer has to find it. It will just be flooded at her all the time. And she will have to become more discerning.
My 10-year-old does this all the time. He's like, Mom, search it up. Search it up.
Yeah.
Like, and he's like, okay, well, it must be true because the search engine told me it was true.
They're better than us. They're so much better than us because of that, in my opinion, that generational advantage, whereas people my age and older, like my mom, for example, tends to share disinformation. They're in that realm where if it comes in, must be true. Somebody sent it to you, it kind of... So I think that's our curse as being slightly old, and that hopefully the next generation won't have to deal with it as significantly as we were. They'll be better adapted. I think they will.
I think there's pros and cons. I mean, I definitely think it's older generations that tend to share misinformation more.
We're so bad.
Not we,
older.
Sorry.
But I'm talking us and older. Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to out my mother, but I think that older people are quite willing to share something that comes off a website like news.truth.org. Like, it clearly doesn't exist. Like, it's got no credibility. But if it feeds the narrative, man, then we'll just post that on the family WhatsApp group.
Yeah, I'm always surprised. Even like quite well educated people, spreading this information and not taking the time to pick up the keys of disinformation.
And as journalists, we fall for it sometimes as well, so we've got to be quite careful. I always say you have to pre-attribute. You always need to make sure that you double, triple source. Where's it coming from? And I've learned, this has been the big adaptation. Remember, I became a journalist before X, Twitter, and I was one of the first journalists to ever live tweet a news event. It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you think about it, makes me sound ancient. But I was sitting in court in the Keble murder trial, and I was sitting next to Adrian Besson, who's now the editor-in-chief at News 24. And we were like, hey, let's try and live tweet this thing. There were no cameras at the time, so we thought, let's give it a go and see what it's like. So we started live tweeting the testimony of Glenn Agliotti and Mikey Schultz, and people loved it because we were tweeting with colour and what they said, and it just kind of blew up. And from there, obviously, it became, through the Oscar Pistorius trial, where there was no cameras for the bail application, and with Barry Bateman, it just became a huge, huge thing. So I think that, in a way, we've had to learn with social media how to do journalism. In the beginning, it was all about being first. We just wanted to be first. We wanted to break it. So it was always like whoever could get the tweet out first. And we learned very quickly that it was better to be right than to be first, because we made mistakes and we got things wrong. And when you're first, you rush and you don't check. And I can't tell you the amount of times that we were first, but we were wrong. And it's, to kind of crawl back from there, it affects your credibility. So we have learned now to just take a pause, make sure it's right, before you rush to break it on social media platforms.
Yeah, there can be a lot of collateral damage.
Yeah.
What is it about being part of a big institution or an organization, such as being like Wayne Duvenage being part of Outer, or journalists being part of a bigger umbrella organization, that affords you protection that whistleblowers don't get? It basically allows people such as yourself and Wayne Duvenage to go around and ask very difficult questions of quite dangerous people, and a whistleblower or just somebody off the street wouldn't have that kind of protection. They'd be quite vulnerable. What is it about these organizations and institutions that does fortify you to be able to undertake the work that you do? I
have never really thought about it like that. I don't know if the institution gives you fortitude, or gives you the ability to do that. I think there's lots of freelance journalists and independent people and civil society activists who are able to do that. I suppose it gives you the comfort of knowing that there's legal backing, that there are resources to assist you, which whistleblowers definitely don't have, which is why the Whistleblower House, which is an NGO that's been set up by whistleblowers, is so important. But I think that because of social media, it's also allowed journalists to create organizations and brands outside of media houses. And when you've got serious clout on social media, you're able to do those things too. I mean, we see a lot of big brand journalists or personalities on social media being able to call out politicians on social media without the backing of a media house. So I suppose yes and no. And I think that's the risk that whistleblowers often run, is the fact that they are so isolated. So it's very easy for a big corporate to just drag them through the courts for years and years and years and completely deplete their resources, or to hire enforcers that follow them around and freak the hell out of them, and that will intimidate them, or that will, blacklist them or discredit them. It's easy for that to happen if you haven't got the resources. If you work for a big media house, you at least have the backing of money and lawyers, and that makes a big difference.
I think that the development of high-powered individuals with media clout in and of themselves is a fantastic and beautiful development in our democracy. I think that it has made journalism and freedom of information more robust and more vibrant than it otherwise would be. So that's something that I definitely enjoy and appreciate. And I think you are right that there are benefits and drawbacks. In some ways, they're more free, and in other ways, they are more resource constrained.
It's kind of like it democratized the media in a way, because what social media has also done is it's allowed everybody to be a journalist. So everyone can be a citizen journalist. Anybody with a phone can, and we've seen that with Gen X, Gen Y in a big way, how they have been able to capture moments in history, have been able to call out politicians, and that's what social media has done. It's made politicians much more accessible. I mean, look at Aidan McKenzie. Anybody can tweet him or send a post on X and he'll respond and engage. We see that with a lot of politicians now, and that really has democratized the political landscape, the media landscape, and I think that's to the benefit. Of course, there's some risks implicit in that, because it means that anybody can say anything, and it can gain traction, whether it's true or not.
I think that two fantastic things have happened in regards to moving power and voices in South Africa in the last few months and years. The first thing being that the ANC had actually removed democracy out of Parliament and into Lutuli House without people knowing it. They used to have their Monday to Friday discussions, then Friday afternoon they'd say goodbye, they'd close their doors at Lutuli House. Monday morning they'd announce what was going to happen in Parliament, and in that sense democracy was removed. With the development and in terms of moving voices back to the public space, I think that people like Aidan McKenzie have done amazingly well to bring the politician back to what in Rome it was described as the forecourt or something, where everyone would come and stand on their box and they would be able to shout and have their say. And he is the politician that's gone back to listen to the people in the forecourt and used technology to leverage that. I think everybody learned a little bit from Donald Trump in that regard. He was obviously very media and camera and social media savvy. And I think that's also a beautiful development where the commoner, so-called commoner, does have access to the Caesars of South African politics.
Yeah. Look, I think that's also the beauty of the Government of National Unity, is that it's forced the ANC back into democracy.
Yes.
That's a great column idea. Thank you very much. So I think that in many ways it's forced the ANC to participate in democracy more.
Yes.
In the sense that there was this lack of division between party and state, and now it's had to become more clear.
Democracy's back in Parliament.
Yeah. So, and I think that because the ANC is now accountable to its GNU partners, it means that it needs to be more transparent. It needs to be more explicit about how it's making decisions, and it can't make decisions alone anymore. and it does have to really consider democracy and how it works. I think what we also saw through the elections was that, and for me, it's one of the most beautiful things about these past elections, is that we saw democracy in full glory. The fact that we had a peaceful transition of power, the fact that we had political parties acting in the interests of the people, that they were able to find one another, that they were able to agree on a power-sharing agreement, that they were able to compromise, where in the past they have not been able to compromise, where we saw parties working together to peacefully elect office bearers in the first sitting of Parliament. It was democracy in all its glory, and it's phenomenal. So I do think that that's what the Government of National Unity has done.
The biggest opportunity that our more radical elements in South African politics had to destabilize and break down the country was the July riots.
Yeah.
They never had a better opportunity before that, and they're probably never going to have another opportunity like that again. That's my personal opinion. We saw, even through that chaos, our courts remained relatively free and independent, maybe not at the magistrates level, but certainly at the higher levels. Our police, they weren't perfect, but they were out there and they were active. When our military was recalled and said you're no longer active inside the borders, they recalled and they went back to their bases. Our hospitals still function, not brilliantly. I know we have a bit of a roller coaster head with the NHI, but when you have a look at all of these institutions collectively, all adding to the vibrance and robustness of our democracy, my outlook is quite excellent, and I would absolutely 100% agree with you that the Government of National Unity is a great development.
Yeah. So look, I think that the high level report into what happened with the July unrest has shown us the flaws of the police. I think that they were, and the intelligence structures, I think that it was a massive failing.
Yes.
But I do always make this point, though, that we largely have rule of law in South Africa. There's no anarchy. I think that for 3-4 days in the July unrest, things fell apart, but ultimately the centre held. The centre held because of the fact that we saw the taxi industry coming to assist. We saw communities defending themselves, and it gave the police time, and it gave the defence forces time to kind of recalibrate and get it together, because they clearly made an error, many errors. And I think that that's crucial, the fact that ultimately we have rule of law. And you think about it, former President Jacob Zuma was sent to jail like an hour, but he was sent to jail. And I always make this point, is that our judiciary has always stood firm. In every single instance where there's been a failing of government, it has been civil society that has stepped into the breach, and the courts that have held the line, and the judiciary. And I think that's crucial in a constitutional democracy such as ours. And we saw that with the July unrest. I think that there should be a lot more people held accountable.
Absolutely.
I don't think we've seen the masterminds or the architects behind the July unrest being arrested and going on trial. I think that has been a big failing of the government and of the law enforcement agencies. We've seen dozens of people being arrested for sharing stuff on social media, but I think that's kind of just collateral. I don't think that it's the actual people behind it. But I agree with you in the sense that ultimately it is the judiciary. We do have rule of law in South Africa. I understand some people have had awful experiences with the criminal justice system. There've also been great successes. And I think we always need to balance that perspective.
I think that our intelligence structures, like the NPA, they were just so vastly hollowed out, not just in terms of infrastructure, but in terms of institutional knowledge and individual capability, that it is possible that they may be able to go back and harness all the data, given that everything's digitized, and find out who these masterminds were. But as it sits, we're still in the phase where we're building up our lower, less sophisticated institutions like the NPA to get intelligence structures that must go in and find macro data off millions of... I think we're so far away from that I have not too much hope of that anytime in the near future.
You know, there's been a massive amount of work being done to recapacitate, particularly at the NPA. And you have to remember the extent of state capture. This was a deliberate, malicious, intentional campaign to hollow out the state. And that's what we saw at the NPAs. We saw almost 50% of capacity leaving and being pushed out. There was a time when the Hawks did not have one forensic accountant. How do you unravel a spaghetti like Steinhoff without a forensic accountant? So I think that there's been a huge amount of work, and it's also just been made public that quite a few of the evidence leaders from the State Capture Commission are now working for the investigating directorate. Guys like Advocate Paul Pretorius, who knows the ins and outs of the State Capture Commission, who was crucial in the writing of the reports and leading the evidence, is now assisting the investigating directorate with the criminal cases against those responsible. And that's huge. Absolutely huge. The day before the end of the sixth administration, President Cyril Ramaphosa signed into law legislation which makes the investigating directorate permanent and gives it security of tenure. That is massive as well, because it's the Scorpions 2.0. So I'm very hopeful that with all of this work being done to recapacitate, we'll start to see, and we are already seeing.
We are seeing it.
We are seeing. We saw Zizi Kodwa being charged. We saw Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula being charged. We've seen 9 seminal state capture cases being enrolled. We've just seen Ace Makashula's PA being extradited. There's progress.
Yes, absolutely. And it's quite easy to see that progress for anyone who wants to open their eyes just a little bit. I see a lot of similarities between what's taking place now with the NPA and what took place in the 80s under Rudy Giuliani in New York, where...
broken window... kind of that
little fish, get the guys at the bottom, and then you step up just a little bit. But it was like there was enough insight to see that they shouldn't just swing straight for the Ace Magashules from day one.
Yeah.
That they should start a little bit at the bottom, and you could see that over time. You could see that over actually the last 3-4 years. And you're just slowly starting to see those little successes coming.
The problem, though, is that you have a public that has run out of patience.
Oh, yeah.
And people, in most rooms that I go into, people are saying, we've got to get the big state capture politicians in orange overhauls. That's what they want to see. So, and I always stress patience. It takes a long time. We live in a constitutional democracy. Unfortunately, we have a situation where people like former President Jacob Zuma are Stalingradding the hell out of the courts.
Yes.
And there is an abuse of the court process. And he's well within his rights to do so. But it means that justice is delayed and it's expensive and the courts become completely saturated by all of these applications. And I think that is infuriating people.
He's done remarkably well to manipulate that tactic to his advantage. I have some... we're running out of time just a little bit, and there's a couple of more sensational questions that I want to ask you, because there's not a lot of people in the country that may or may not know about these.
Okay.
So it's a little bit of a segue.
I may or may not answer them.
Yeah, you may or may not answer them. That I also realize because it may be sensitive, or you might just not know about the...
Okay.
Are you able to share any information with regards to the very sophisticated assassinations that we're starting to see in South Africa? We're very aware of Nkabi culture. They can be relatively well organized and relatively sophisticated, like we've seen with the attempted assassination of the investigating officer or
the SARS
yes,
advocate, yeah.
Yes. But we're also seeing things like Murray Kluti, where it takes a remarkable amount of skill to execute that kind of assassination. It's not an Nkabi-style assassination that has all the hallmarks of Eastern European-style military training. And more specifically with Colonel Matipa, who is investigating the Lady R. That shot, I believe, was taken by captured special forces. I believe that there was a recce unit that was captured in South Africa. And I think that a South African trained military personnel in the special forces was the trigger puller on that assassination. That shot was way too sophisticated. Okay. I know some of the best marksmen in the country couldn't pull that off.
Look, I mean, you probably know more about this than I do at this point, if you have a whole theory going over there. So, look, I think that what I will say is that what is extremely concerning for me is how easy it has become to kill people. The Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime did a study into targeted assassinations in South Africa, from the taxi industry to political assassinations to personal contract killings, and it's just alarming at the rate. And for me, what's extremely concerning is when you see the underworld spilling into the overworld, where you see legitimate businesses have to do business through the barrel of a gun. So you look at Cluttermurray, which I think that has had a chilling effect on lots of investigators, liquidators, lawyers. The shooting of the SARS advocate similarly could have a chilling effect, and that's very frightening. Who is actually pulling the trigger? I do not know. 5 or 6 years ago, there were a series of killings in South Africa relating to the Serbian mafia, where they were largely killing each other.
Yes.
So we saw a lot of very professional hits being carried out by shooters on the back of motorbikes, wearing helmets. They were never arrested. There were never any breakthroughs made. They were very professional. All of those assassins were coming from Eastern Europe. I get the sense that this is not being done by the Serbians in the same way. I could be wrong. I mean, your theory may be perfectly valid. What is evident is that we are not making arrests. So you look at the case of Babita Diakoran, where the shooters were arrested, and there the shooters came from northern KZN. They were in Kabi Hitmen. With Cluttermurray, we haven't got arrests. So I think that what we're seeing now is more in Kabi Hitmen, but in some of the cases you've mentioned, it could be something more sophisticated.
I think that organized crime with relatively large amounts of cash money must be responsible for these more sophisticated hits. I think that with Cluttermurray, it's possible that it's professionals that have come in from other countries, and before the forensic report is, or a policeman even knows that there's been a murder.
It's possible. I mean, you look at AKA, and that was Eswatini.
Yeah.
So, sometimes it's sophisticated, sometimes not so much.
The gold mafia, that story died so quickly. I thought that was the most important story to come out of Southern African geopolitics in a very long time. It launched, it hit, it was so sensational. Everybody was talking about it. For me, it illustrated an overlap between high-level politicians across Southern Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, in some kind of collusion or some kind of network to launder gold and money. And we had nefarious underworld figures that were involved, cigarette smugglers and that sort of thing. And I'm just wondering, why did that story die so quickly?
I think it was a lack of accountability again. I don't know why it died so quickly, because it really, for me, that was a great example of the kind of stories that I've often reported on, where you see this nexus between politics and politicians, big business, law enforcement, and you require all of those to work together in order for an organized crime syndicate to really be effective. You can't have two of those arms. You need all three to happen. You need the money, you need the syndicates, you need the political clout, and that was a perfect example. What you had there as well was the collaboration of financial institutions as well, so it added that extra layer. I'm not sure why it died so quickly. Maybe because of a lack of accountability, but I suspect it's not dead. I suspect the journalists are still trying to keep it alive.
I hope somebody is still trying to keep it alive. I think it's such an important story for South Africa. And I think that if the Southern African region in general, geopolitical region in general, is going to uncouple the shackles of corruption. This is the highest level cross-border case I've ever heard of or seen, and I certainly hope that there is a team of journalists out there with resources and investigators and everything required to kind of chase that thing up. I think it would be...
They did a pretty good job the first time around, so... yeah,
just so amazing. I would like to see more nitty-gritty detail, particularly with regard to the South African role players. We've got such dodgy politicians and businessmen.
Yes, businessmen. They do import-export.
Yeah, I am always amazed at what people can get away with once they've got just a little bit of a cross-border infrastructure. You actually don't need that much. One or two fake businesses in one or two other countries, and guys are starting to operate. And we just have such a proliferation of that kind of thing in South Africa. I do believe that the global institutions and South Africa are slowly starting to catch up with it, and that we are doing a better job of knowing who these people are, policing them to some extent.
I think we've got a pretty robust financial system.
Correct.
In South Africa. You know, that's world class in many ways. So I do think that counts in our favour. But we do still have very porous borders. We do still have very willing, corrupt officials that are often complicit as well. So it's not difficult to create a cross-border network like that.
We have kind of run out of time. We said that we would do an hour. So I've got just...
for the record, that's my fault.
No,
you said 90 minutes and I said an hour. So.
No, you've cut me out of half an hour of absolute waffling. You have no idea how...
Excellent.
To the point
That's how I like things, you know. You got to do it hard and fast.
It was really going to be a mess if you'd given me that extra half an hour.
You managed to cover a lot, though. Don't worry.
I've got so many questions because over the years I've read most of your books and followed your career, and you also speak to people that I listen to. So in my head I've listed all these questions and I've had to prioritize them.
So I'll tell you what, if people like and share and post, and this podcast does well, we'll do a round 2.
Thank you. We will make sure that it does very well, and particularly with shorts, so it gets broken down into shorts, and that does very well on things like TikTok with younger audiences. So we will get this interview out there. I guess 2 last questions. We'll just have our moment of optimism here. We've threaded it like a golden thread throughout the conversation. So you and I haven't been quite like my friend Mike Sham, who I absolutely love, but he's somewhat more pessimistic.
Yes, we landed up arguing a lot.
Yeah, it's
because I'm more optimistic and he's more pessimistic.
Let's float each other's boats now with optimism.
Yes.
Our NPA, as we've stated, doing better. It's growing in terms of its capability, in terms of individuals and their capabilities. Our new police chief looks like he knows what's going on. Even guys like Gayton McKenzie have come out swinging from the fences. They're robust, they're vibrant. Our media and press, absolutely free. Our courts are doing amazingly well. Our sports teams are absolutely killing it. I think our sports teams are absolutely killing it. Our individuals are killing it. We've got Dricus du Plessis fighting really soon. We've got all the Olympic medals coming back home. And we've got a beautiful country filled with resources and beautiful spaces. And it's not a time to be optimistic. We've come out of the trenches. I think we've seen the worst of it, and we can look to a brighter future. Is there anything else that you think I've missed?
Yeah, so for me, and this is what my keynote is about, right? Is about active citizenship. It's about the fact that we need to have perspective. So you can't be Pollyanna and be like everything's amazing. We only won 6 medals at the Olympics, which is okay-ish. But I think that we need perspective, right? And one of the big positives for me at the moment is Operation Vulindlela and what is happening in terms of cooperation between the private sector and government through Operation Vulindlela in Treasury and in the presidency. And I think we've seen enormous progress taking place there when it comes to logistics and the logistics framework with the ports and the rail networks, when it comes to crime and corruption, when it comes to power generation and the work that's being done to bring additional power onto the grid, lifting the generation cap, seconding experts to coal-fired power stations, rooftop solar, wind generation, all of that. I think that there's fantastic work being done, and Operation Vulindlela is going into its second phase now, which is going to look at municipalities. So that for me is a huge positive. I think that that's going to drive growth. It's going to drive job creation, and I'm very excited about that. And this is important. I think that we need responsible corporate citizens. I think we need active citizenship. I think that we need people to really step up and be invested. And if you're going to stick around and bitch and moan, great. If you have the resources to leave. But if you're going to be here. And be invested, be an active citizen, get involved.
That's amazing, and that's absolutely valuable advice. And people certainly are stepping up into that space. I see, for example, my friend Julia Fish under Wayne Duvenage popping up quite recently, and people like that are really going to help fortify change.
Yeah.
So thank you for that note. And then the last thing is, what's next for you? Have you got any big investigations under the way? Have you got any books on the horizon?
So I think that the last few months in South Africa has been pretty wild. I spent a lot of time covering the elections and the GNU negotiations. I spent a lot of time talking about that now, just explaining to people the dynamics and the political landscape in the country. And then I do a daily radio show. So all of that keeps me super busy. I would like to write another book, which is kind of in the early stages. The problem in South Africa is you have so much to choose from, right? But I'm due another book, so I'd like to make time for that. But just daily developments are keeping me so busy that I need to create space and time to do that.
I know that South Africans would really look forward to whatever book is coming next. I think that South Africans would absolutely just eat it up, and whatever it is, I'm sure it's going to be absolutely juicy.
It's going to be a children's book. No, it'll be crime fiction, which I would like to do one day. But we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Thank you very much for spending your time with us. We really appreciate it. You punch well above our weight, so we really, really appreciate it.
I enjoyed the conversation. It was fantastic.
Thank you. You're very kind. And if you'd like to hear more from Mandy Wiener, you can follow her on all her socials. I know she's pretty much everywhere. I found her on LinkedIn, Facebook. She's on Twitter. Go out there, follow her, find her, buy her books and read them. They're truly fantastic. Eye-openers for South Africans. And I'm Aidan Brown, Mandy Wiener, and my good friend Ben Matjiu in studio. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye for now.